Welcome to Good Catholic Great Stories, where we explore fascinating stories from and for the world of Catholicism.
Welcome, everybody. I am Whitney Hetzel, your host, and we are here today with Father Joseph Matlak, and we have a great, I was going to say discussion, but hopefully it will mostly be Father just explaining some things. We asked him to come today to share with us, really give us an understanding, basic, general understanding about the differences and similarities between the Eastern Church, which he is in the tradition of, and the Western Church. So as American Catholics, I think we're surprised to learn that the Church is much larger than just the Roman or Latin rite. There are actually more than 20 other liturgical rites in the Catholic Church, all of them ancient and of equal dignity. But they are all in full communion. And we have so much to learn from the Eastern Church. Just to start us off, I thought I would just start with John Paul II's quote, that we can only fully breathe with each lung, the Eastern and the Western Church. So hopefully that will get us started here, Father, and you can just go at it and share with us all you want to share.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here with you. Well, I think the best way to introduce this is to give, firstly, a historical overview of how we got to where we're at. I'll take you back to Pentecost. The Holy Spirit descends upon the apostles in the tongues of fire, and of course, they begin speaking in various different languages, which is a foreshadowing of their mission to go throughout the whole world and to baptize all of the nations and to teach them the gospel at Matthew 28:19. So the apostles disperse throughout the known world. Peter goes to Antioch and then to Rome, Mark to Alexandria in Egypt, Thomas to India, and Philip to Ethiopia, and so on. Of course, when they go to those areas of the known world, they are bringing the one gospel with them, but the one gospel meets the local culture. And what occurs is a synthesis, not of the faith, but of expressing and embodying the one faith. So the apostles are translating the gospel into the local languages to preach the gospel to those people. And eventually, the apostles and those disciples and those nascent churches begin to celebrate, to pray and explain the faith in their own language, many times according to their own customs. But of course, they're taking the one faith that they've learned. So it's not that they're inventing new faiths where they go. It's just that what's happening is a human experience meets the divine, or the divine meets the human, which is the story of the Bible, which is the story of Christ. A divine person takes on human flesh and comes to speak to us in our language. So the language is like a key opening up the one mystery of Christ, the gospel of Christ. All of those local expressions of the one faith exist in communion. And of course, there's no communication. So after a while, after hundreds of years and generations upon generations of descendants of those original peoples, it becomes something that belongs to their people, but it's very easy to forget that the same faith exists in multiple other places, in various other languages. So the Indian Christian experience looks different from the Egyptian Christian experience, which looks different from the Roman experience, which looks different from the Greek experience. And so for the first 1,000 years, we just had this development in the life of the church. Eventually, Christianity within the known empire, the Roman Empire, comes to be crystallized in 5 major urban centers. And the fancy word for that is the pentarchy, just the Greek word for 5, the 5 rulers or the 5 heads. The first of those urban centers, or Cs, S-E-E-S, is Rome, Elder Rome because it was the capital of the Roman Empire. It also was the place where the first of the apostles, Peter, died. And so the descendants of the Petrine role resided in Rome. Also, to an extent, in Antioch, because he was there, and then Alexandria somewhat, because Mark was his disciple, so Mark went down there. But specifically in Rome. And then eventually the second was Alexandria. Alexandria was a major urban center stretching way back before Christianity. Of course, Alexander the Great with its great library. And then Antioch. Antioch was a very important Greek-speaking city, and therefore that became third. Well, eventually, 312, 313, the Emperor Constantine has his conversion, wins the Battle of Milvian Bridge, and legalizes Christianity through the Edict of Milan. Christianity comes up from underground, having been persecuted ferociously under Diocletian, his predecessor. And in the year 331, Constantine decides that he wanted to move the capital of the empire to sort of an old Greek center with the name Byzantion, and so he renames it Constantinople. And so Constantinople becomes, New Rome becomes the most important city. And so that, however, Old Rome retains its position of preeminence. So you have Old Rome retains its first position amongst all of those bishops. Constantinople takes the second place. Alexandria gets bumped down to third. Antioch gets bumped down to fourth. And eventually Jerusalem comes in fifth place. And so you have those five major centers of Christianity. One is Western, which is the Roman tradition, and the other four are Eastern. And roughly speaking, the West is speaking in Latin, and the East is speaking, well, if you're in the urban centers, you're speaking Greek. If not, you might be speaking some of the local languages like Syriac or Coptic or Ge'ez in Ethiopia. For the first 1,000 years, the churches are living more or less in communion with a few breaks here and there, but tensions are building up because what happens when you speak different languages and you're not encountering people? Well, again, a human experience happens where you begin to start to see the other as somehow not who you are, or not your own. And those worlds begin to drift apart, especially exacerbated by the linguistic differences. So a Latin isn't speaking to a Greek because he can't speak Greek, and vice versa. The Greek can't speak Latin. And so they're beginning, and so with the social and the political upheavals taking place and the cultural upheavals, it's very easy to fall into seeing that the other as the enemy. So they even had names for each other. I remember the Latins would call the Greeks the perfidious little Greek. That was their insult. And the Greek would look at the Latin and call them the reckless Italian. So this is how they were, And then around the time of the turn of the 1054 was really the date that's given. There occurs quite possibly one of the greatest tragedies in Christianity. Cardinal Humbert, who was no fan of the Greeks himself, goes to Constantinople and excommunicates Patriarch Michael Kerularios, and then Michael Kerularios reciprocates and excommunicates the Latins. The unfortunate thing is that the Pope had died by the time, during the journey of Humbert from Rome to Constantinople, and so the excommunication was null and void, but the damage was done. And that was really sort of it's traditionally given as the start of what's called the Great Schism between the East and the West, between the Latin and the Greek world. And the Latin church in the West begins to associate itself with what we now know as the Roman Catholic Church. Those Eastern churches, the four of them, in fact, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem over here in the East, begin to be known as the Orthodox Church. In the first millennium, of course, those words were I mean, they meant different things. Catholic means universal. Orthodox means right worship, and by extension, right belief. But again, the West is this, the East is that, and they're, sort of the separation has taken place. Within the 13th, 14th, 15th century periods, a number of attempts at reunion are taking place, most especially the Council of Lyon in 1274, Council of Ferrara-Florence in 1439. Of course, the latter one was almost successful in reuniting the Greek church with the Latin church, again, mostly for political reasons, because the Greeks needed money and military help against the invading Turks. But because both of these worlds are so religious, that it's very hard to compromise on your religious convictions if that's the driving force of your culture. So that didn't work. Eventually, Rome's attempt to bring in the entire body of the East wasn't working. There was way too much animosity, way too much political upheaval and history. It wasn't working. So a different strategy was adopted, mostly buttressed by orders like the Jesuits, to offer a reunion to portions of those Eastern churches. And the previous technique had been to make good Latins out of those Easterners. So, again, if the Latin Rite Mass is superior, well, then they have to celebrate that Mass. They must be praying in Latin, speaking in Latin. Where that technique didn't work. So instead, perhaps there was a way of allowing whoever wanted to come into communion with Rome to come into communion with Rome and retain their traditions, so especially their liturgical traditions and various other spiritual devotions and feast days and so forth. They are allowed to come back into communion with Rome, and they can keep that. And that was more successful. So again, for political reasons, but also, through personal choice, those various bodies are coming into communion with Rome. And the first of those reunions took place in 1596, the Union of Brest, which ushered in the tradition, the particular Eastern Church that I belong to, which is now the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And then the last of which, my understanding was, I think 1930 was when the Syro-Malankara Church of India came into communion with Rome. So they're retaining their characteristics, they retained their liturgy, they retained their spiritual tradition, they retained their canonical disciplines, which are sometimes very different from the Latin disciplines, and they retained their theological way of expressing the faith, which is different from the Latin or the Roman faith, or I should say the Latin or the Roman tradition. So it's important to make loads of distinctions here. There's one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, which in itself was divided by the schism. Now, there are 5 major sees of Christendom, the pentarchy: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Now, with all of these reunions taking place, there are 23 different Eastern Catholic churches. Now, I use that term quite deliberately because it is the term used by canon law, by the teaching of the church. The previous term that had been used was rites. And it's an incorrect term, because when I describe an entire body of Christians as a rite, well, I'm basically calling them a liturgy. Well, a human being is not necessarily a liturgy. A liturgy is a liturgy, and a liturgy forms a human being or a group of Christians. But the church uses the terminology churches. There's one universal church, but there are local churches. So each diocese is a local church, at the head of which is the bishop. Each distinctive Eastern or Western tradition is also spoken of as a church, because again, it has its own hierarchy. So, for example, the church in Ukraine, the church of my ancestors, has its own hierarchy. And that church prays with this specific rite, has this specific spiritual tradition, has these canonical disciplines, explains the faith theologically in this way, has a particular hierarchy over it. And that is a church. It's an Eastern church, an Eastern church in communion with all of the other Eastern Catholic churches and in communion with the Latin Church, the Church of Rome. So it's also incorrect to say the Eastern Church because there are 23 of them. So there are 23 Eastern churches. There are also 5 liturgical families. So I just add another 5 in there. 5 liturgical families. The biggest one, the most famous one, is the Latin Rite. But interestingly enough, even though it's the biggest, it's the minority because it's one tradition as opposed to the 4 others which exist in the East. The biggest of the traditions is numerically is the Latin, but the biggest one in terms of how many Eastern churches use it is the Byzantine or the Greek tradition, which comes down from Constantinople. So all of those churches that inherited their Christianity from the Greek way of being Christian, or the Byzantine way, the Byzantine is another word for Greek, pray using that rite. And there's a whole list of churches using that rite. Then there's the East Syrian, the West Syrian, and then the Coptic from Africa. And it's sort of the Armenian one sort of stands off on its own. It's a very interesting history in and of itself. The first nation to actually call itself Christian. So in 1595, the first union happens, and all those unions happen subsequently. And for those hundreds of years, we did lose a lot. Being in union with Rome, we're in union with the older brother, and the older brother is bigger and has more resources, and so eventually we start to want to be just like our big brother, because we love our big brother, right? Or he's more powerful than us and can pummel us. But what eventually the popes, beginning especially with Leo the 13th, Pius the 11th, John the 23rd, John Paul II especially, begin to encourage the Eastern churches in union with Rome to recover the traditions that they have lost. Why would that be important? Well, because they are supposed to be examples to the non-Catholic Eastern churches, known as the Orthodox churches, what it would be like to be in communion with Rome. In other words, you can fully live your tradition even though you're in union with Rome. The great fear, of course, being that you can't. And historically, yes, that did happen. We did lose a lot of our traditions. So those popes, the Second Vatican Council, canon law, the documents since then, have been constantly encouraging us to return to those traditions. Again, to have our own liturgy, purely our own, not to try and copy the Latin Church, and vice versa. To have our own spiritual tradition. We have all these ancient prayers, all these devotions, all this spirituality that comes from the fathers, and especially the monastic tradition. That's to be kept by us. To have our own disciplines, we have our own feast days, we have our own fasting laws, and so on. And finally, to have our own theological language, which is different from the Latin theological language, but not opposed to it. So we Eastern Catholics, to sum up, are really living that experience of the first millennium, when those Christians of the East were in communion with the Latin Church. We just have a lot more communication with it now, which, please God, prevents things like misunderstanding and schism, where we can learn each other's language, can get to know one another, can speak to one another, and actually learn from one another and inspire one another in that. So that's a sort of a historical overview of who and what we are, which can be very confusing.
That was very helpful, though, I think, to kind of put it into a concept and to see where it kind of how it started and where it is today because of that. So I'm not mathematical at all, but I was thinking as you were describing it, sort of a Venn diagram, sort of where you have this Catholic Roman rite, and then you have the Eastern churches, and then where they overlap kind of is where we can be, or would you say that it's all under one kind of circle in that regard?
It might be a bit of both if you think about it. So it's the Latin Church. So even that language, or Ecclesia Latina, is the Latin. So I suppose you could say it's all one circle, full of different colors. I sometimes like to describe it as walking into Regent's Park in London and seeing all the different roses. Well, they're all roses, but one's yellow, one's red, one's, I don't know, violet or something. But the Venn diagram image also helps because, yes, you have the core of which is what we share, which is the gospel, the one faith. But it is expressed in now in this way, now in that way, now in a third way. And all of it is legitimate. Pope Leo XIII, I believe, once said, "The Church of Christ is neither Latin, nor Greek, nor Slav. It is Catholic." So he reminded us of the kernel, the core of the faith, which, of course, the Church is living in unity, not uniformity. That's another thing too. We do have different expressions. The unity is that there's a fundamental unity which should not demand uniformity necessarily. Obviously, we obey the church when the church asks us to do something to be uniform, where we must be uniform. But where there is freedom, then we can observe it in a different. I think St. Augustine of Hippo said something like this: in freedom, liberty, in necessary things, unity, but in all things, charity. So we live that mystery as the church.
Can you explain and share with us a little bit more about how sometimes the Eastern lung is described as more mystical in its expression, and the Western lung is described more as intellectual, or explaining it that way?
There's a certain truth to that, but I do have a difficulty with that. And some of the later Greek fathers as well, such as St. Maximus the Confessor, or St. John of Damascus, St. Nicholas Kabasilas even later, really make a concerted effort to explain the faith as more than just a mystery. They're really offering a systematic, dogmatic, theological approach. Where the whole intellectual versus mystical thing comes in is really because of the scholasticism that took place in the High Middle Ages in the West by Peter Lombard, Thomas Aquinas, and Bonaventure, and the Latin tradition since then. And the East has now has not really had that kind of theological expression since before that time, or since around that time. Not to say that there aren't theologians, there are, but no giants in comparison with those names. And so they're really, I would say it's a bit of a false opposition to say the West is this and the East is that. It's probably more correct to say in the earliest years, the East was more scholastic because, of course, it had access to things like the Greek philosophical tradition and those fathers that actually did have a philosophical training in very famous schools, such as, I think, Athens, if I'm not mistaken, before the Emperor Justinian closed it down. But then it shifted to the West around the High Middle Ages. And now the East is living off of a development that really took off in the 3rd, 4th century, which is the monastic tradition, which has really colored the Eastern Christian experience. But that's not also exclusive of the East, because the Benedictines did the same for the West. So you see, historically, it's not so correct to say one lung is this, the other lung is that. It's probably more correct to say in which period was this tendency more evident. In that period, it's more evident for this group. In another period, it's more evident for the other group, which is why being a Catholic and knowing the history behind it really helps to contextualize these things. Because we can see that each lung offers its own experience, and they're rather similar to one another. They may simply be expressed in a different language.
Since you mentioned the similarity, and you have rights, right, with the Byzantine, Greek, and the Latin, and or you can say the Novus Ordo, the Latin, right, and the Byzantine. Can you explain a little bit about that, just personally,
So yes, I was ordained for to celebrate in the Byzantine or the Greek rite, and of course that's my tradition. And in order to celebrate in another rite, I need permission of the Holy See, which I did. I was able to achieve about a year after my ordination, in order to assist the growing population of Latin Rite Catholics, Latin Catholics, who they just need the ministrations of a priest. So in order to celebrate the sacred mysteries for them in their tradition, I was given permission from the Holy See to do that. So it wasn't necessarily for my own personal enrichment, it's for them, although it does enrich you personally. As I've learned through my own experience, there is no better way to rediscover the Eucharist than to learn how to celebrate it in another rite, because it forces you to learn how to do it all over again. It takes you back to the beginning. And one of the great dangers as a priest is that this becomes rote. And so we begin to celebrate these sacred mysteries simply because we have to. But to celebrate them as though it were our first time and our last time, it was an aid. I'm not saying it's necessary, but for me personally, it was a great help to get into that mindset.
And any Catholic really can go to divine liturgy.
Yes.
In like, say, for instance, St. Basil the Great, we can go there and experience that, right?
Yes, canon law is very clear. Any Catholic can fulfill the obligation in any Catholic rite. We share some of the feast days in common, and we don't share others. So, for example, one of the feast days we share in common is the Feast of the Annunciation. So for us, actually, it's a holy day of obligation, but Latin Rite Catholic can walk into our parish and celebrate that feast with us, and vice versa. I can go to, say, a Latin church on Christmas Day and observe the feast there. But then each of us has our own unique feast days. So, for example, the feast on which I was ordained on October the 1st. I say October the 1st, many Latin Catholics immediately think St. Therese of Lisieux. Well, for us, it was the feast of the protecting veil of Mary, which is a unique thing to the Byzantine Church. So, again, yes, we do have many visitors coming through, some of which will say things like, did I even walk into a Catholic church? Are you even Catholic? I think many Byzantine parishes feel they have to put a large picture of the Holy Father with a Vatican flag outside, and even then that doesn't always work. So, but it's a great educational moment. I think I might have to put a big sign at the back of my church. Yes, we are Catholic. Please come in. You are welcome, and vice versa.
So I've been to the Divine Liturgy at St. Basil, and it was an amazing experience. Could you share some of the, I hate to go into the differences, but it really did strike me as, like you said, it didn't feel necessarily at first, even when you walked in, it seemed there were certain focal points that were different. So could you just share with us some of those differences, and then we can talk about obviously the things that are similar.
The easiest way to characterize our liturgical experience is to compare it to to borrow the language from the Second Vatican Council, the noble simplicity of the West. The Latin tradition, at least for the longest time, has been much more simple and to the point. The prayers are shorter, through Christ our Lord, Amen. It's just and you could even think of the great missionaries. I mean, to take one book to the Pacific Islands is easier than to take 30, which is, I think our whole library is something like that. But interestingly enough, we were missionaries before, because St. Cyril and Methodius took the Greek rite and evangelized all of these Slavic countries with the Greek Christianity. So you see how things change. The Latins become the missionaries after we do, but those nations were much more powerful and affluent. So the reason why Roman Christianity spread throughout the world is, again, it's tied up to that political reality. So the Latin tradition is noble, it's simple, it's stark, to the point. The Eastern tradition is much more flowery and poetic. It's sung a cappella in imitation of the angels. You walk into the church and there are icons everywhere. The notion is you're in heaven on earth. And the liturgy is more or less unchanged since it's obviously grown from a kernel. Our liturgy stretches back by tradition to St. Basil the Great in the 4th century, St. John Chrysostom. And so we're still praying those same prayers. We merely translated them into vernacular languages. So in most cases, in some countries, they still use sort of ancient language like Slavonic or Greek. My particular parish uses English, but it's the same prayers and the same melodies. And the liturgy is more or less unchanged. And so I think when a Latin Catholic comes in, if they're not used to that, they'll feel very much overwhelmed by the sense experience. And everything is based on the senses. So the beauty of the icons, so the sight, the smell of the incense, so the smell, the touching and the kissing of the icons, the sense of touch, the music, the chanting, so it's all the sense of hearing, and the taste, obviously the Eucharist, the body of Christ, body and blood of Christ. So it's a much less intellectual experience, not that it's anti-intellectual, but it's a much less intellectual experience, more of an elaborate expression of theological poetry, which has been inherited from the fathers, which we enter into, and even the language that we use in the East. I don't offer the liturgy, I serve the liturgy. So I'm merely serving what's there. I open the book, I do what it says, and I close the book. I'm serving something bigger than me. So in the East, it's much more you enter into something, and you're entering into the position of the angels, which is why for so many it can feel very exhausting. With liturgy, the very word means the work of the people. It's hard work. It's hard. If a priest isn't sweating, by the time he's done, there's something wrong. He hasn't worked necessarily. I mean, I'm generalizing, but I often feel that way. So it's much more of that than I go in, say I go to my pew and I do nothing and I observe. There's no, I mean, you can do that, of course, but instinctively Latin Catholics will tell me, I didn't think I could. I didn't think I could stand there and listen. They felt like they had to do something. And it's funny because I laugh and I say, no, you don't have to do everything. Sometimes it is better just to stand there and watch and observe and to prepare yourself, to teach yourself by doing. So that's just a distinctive characteristic of our rite. Very much a total body experience, which includes the mind.
And you mentioned standing there. So in the at St. Basil, for instance, when I went, there were a few chairs on the outside, but can you also talk to us about that? The difference between the standing in your church and in the pews, and the sitting, the kneeling, and the other.
So my understanding is that pews were a Protestant invention, in the sense that if you go to the ancient basilicas before the Reformation, the nave was very much an empty of seats. So the notion is people would sort of come in, crowd in like sheep, crowding into their sheep pen. Eventually, with the rejection of the sacraments, what came to be emphasized was the sermon, and I seem to remember, that people would drag in the park benches, and that became the pews that we know today, and it just became elaborate. And then eventually the Catholic churches adopted those. Now, most of the Eastern churches in Western countries also have pews. It's just again, we've adopted that, and sitting is fine. It's just that sometimes pews are very they obstruct the liturgical action. So our liturgy is very processional based, and so sometimes if you have pews, it's really difficult to do the processions that characterize our liturgy. We're a very processional liturgy. It's difficult to do that when trying to sort of maneuver around pews. Also, during the Great Fast, during Lent, we do have the full prostrations to the ground. It's very difficult to prostrate when there's a big pew in front of you. So oftentimes people will have to come out of the pew, go to the aisle. It's very strange. So at St. Basil, even before I arrived, the congregation had decided to not have seats in the middle of the nave, but to have seats traditionally, as per the Eastern tradition, on the outside, because the notion is that when you go to heaven, the scriptures speak of us standing around the throne of God. It doesn't speak of us as sitting in the pew before the throne of God. So the notion is we're going into heaven, we're standing around the throne of God, and then if we need to sit, then we go to the side and we sit. The action is rather, it's reverent, but it is a more free-flowing reverence than Western Catholics are familiar with. So in the West, you must stand, sit, and kneel at very determined times. Now, it is incorrect to say that we don't have that. We do. We must stand for the gospel. We must stand and bow for the sanctification of the gifts. We should be standing for blessings and when we are being censed by the deacon. However, at other points, the normal position is to stand. However, there are times when the normal position is to sit. So the reading of the Psalter, the very word for the reading of the Psalter at that point literally means the sitting down. So originally they would have sat down probably. Maybe not on a pew, maybe on the ground, maybe on a stool, maybe on their knees, sort of in a kneel sit position. And they would have stood for, and there's another word, the stasis, the standing up at that point. And then if they feel tired or weak or ill, or say, there's a mother or an expectant mother, of course she goes and she sits. Ultimately, they are in the Father's house. And what do you do when you're in your Father's house? You stand when you need, and you sit when you need. Although there are times when, well, at least traditionally, perhaps in my culture of Europe, lady walks in the room, all the men would stand. So similar things like that. Christ is coming in procession, everybody gets up. Christ is blessing the people and the priest, everybody gets up. Christ is honoring you when the deacon is censing you with the censer. You stand if you're able to. If you're not able to, then you sit. So again, it's really, sometimes it's amusing to watch a visitor because they really stress themselves out, but they're doing it with such a good will. Like I feel like I have to, and it's, you try to tell them, no, please be comfortable. No one's going to judge you here. This is the house of God. We'll help you as much as we can, but just enjoy the experience and pray. Pray. It's one saint even said, it is better to pray, and it's better to think of God sitting down than to think of your back complaining standing. So just enter into that spirit of prayer.
One of the beautiful things I saw, maybe this is a minor part of the liturgy, but I thought it was really beautiful, the words that are sung or spoken before, "O wisdom, be attentive," or something of that sort. Can you share with us what that
Probably
means?
because the people were getting lazy and distracted, and so the deacon would come out and sing Sophia, orthi. By the way, that word orthi means stand up, stand straight. So he would come out and sing Sophia, wisdom. So basically, listen up, people, pay attention, stand up, because something's about to happen. And usually he does that when the priest is about to perform an action like a blessing or a consecration of something of that nature.
That was really a beautiful thing to watch. I think that could be something that we could we probably need in some of the Catholic churches. Be attentive. Well, what can you share with us for those listeners who are maybe have never been to a divine liturgy, or for those who may really don't even think of themselves as being that interested in it? What can you share with us as a reason to go to divine liturgy, experience that?
So I'd say there's a negative, if you will, reason to get to know the Eastern tradition, as well as a very positive reason. So when I say negative, what I really mean by that is it prevents ignorance. So the historical ignorance that I spoke about earlier, where one side just doesn't know the other side and invents all kinds of falsities and sometimes lack of charity that can result from that about the other traditions in the church, and especially in a culture like North America, where there is a melding of people, which is a result of the melting pot, which is America. Then to know that there exists these other traditions simply helps to remind people that, no, these people are Catholic Christians as well. And simply because they don't pray like us, they are praying in a legitimate ancient way, but it's no less dignified than what we are doing, and vice versa. And the positive reason I would like to give is sort of connected with that, but it goes off of what St. John Paul II said in his encyclical Unitatis Redintegratio, where he said that the Church of Christ must breathe with her both lungs, her Eastern and her Western lung. And he offered that image to show that the Church of Christ is not simply Western, is not simply Eastern, it's both. And therefore, each tradition has a treasure to offer the other, to offer the whole. John Paul II said a similar thing in his apostolic letter, Orientale Lumen, the light of the East. He offered this notion as the sun rises in the East, and so the light, Christ came from the East. So in a sense, you could say Christianity is an Eastern religion. I found that very fascinating the first time I heard that. The light of the East, as Christ illumines the world, but the light of the Christian East is also enough to shed light on perhaps things that even Western people might be looking for. Each tradition in the church has a genius to it. And we are richer, we are more complete, learning from multiple geniuses than merely my own. So the more I come to know the way that Christ has revealed himself to the world, the richer my experience of him will be.
Thank you, Father Joseph, so much for coming and sharing with us today. I hope that others, certainly feel that we were enlightened and understand a little bit more about the differences and the similarities and how much we have to gain from just the experience of divine liturgy and the Eastern tradition. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, and may God bless you always.
Thank you for joining us on Good Catholic Great Stories. If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to leave a review and subscribe. You can listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and wherever podcasts are available. You can also watch the videos of these podcasts on our Good Catholic YouTube channel. Learn more at goodcatholic.com. Thanks for listening, and God bless.